And welcome back. In the mixture of different things I do as a freelance musician, one of the more unnoticed tasks I'll take on from time to time is repairing and servicing drum equipment for local schools, churches, and studios. One of the benefits of my YouTube channel and videos related to restoring, building, and modifying drums has been more awareness to my abilities to help others with equipment in need of repair. I was approached recently by my alma mater, Oshkosh West High School, to take their well-loved Gretsch USA Bop kit and try to get it back to working order for the upcoming school year. I was excited to take this on because they actually bought this kit when I was a junior in high school, and I cherished that set, and it was a big part of my development as a high school student playing in jazz band. But in the 13 years since I've graduated high school, this kit has seen a lot of wear and tear. At one point, I know they used this kit in the pit for the marching band and had some rust develop across a lot of the metal components from being used out in the rain. And a few parts have either disappeared or worn out, like the bass drum spurs and the floor tom leg feet. I knew this kit would benefit from a deep clean, so I started by totally stripping all the tension rods, hoops, and heads, and after that, I removed all the lugs and any other brackets or hardware attached to the shells. During this process, I tried to use a logical method for storing all these parts, so I'd know which screws belong with which lugs or brackets when I'd go back to reassemble. After I had everything stripped, I could start with the first batch of hardware, getting a bath in WD-40. I didn't have enough of this on hand to soak all the hardware at once, so I broke it up into multiple batches. While the first batch of hardware soaked, I shifted my attention to ordering some parts for replacement. First of which was the rubber feet and lock nuts for the bass drum spurs. And while the floor tom wasn't missing its rubber feet, they were pretty ratty, so I ordered a set of these for replacement as well. In addition to these parts, I also ordered a new resonant snare side head and snare wires, as both were pretty worn out. The other heads weren't in bad shape, so we decided not to replace those at this time. With the shells now stripped, I gave them a nice cleaning by using a mixture of soapy water with a magic clean eraser. This was mostly just to remove some light scuffs and build up on the shells. It doesn't seem like it would do much, but I'm always impressed, especially on these lighter natural wood shells, how much it freshens up the finish. My next step was to actually take this virgin bass drum and drill it out for a tom post and mount. I know I'll have mixed feelings towards this in the comments, but with this school needing something more durable and convenient to use for multiple situations, it made sense to avoid the need of an extra stand for this kit to mount the rack tom. I actually had both the Gretsch bass drum plate and tom arm lying around my stock of drum parts, so I was happy to donate these in order to help make this kit more efficient for use throughout the high school. I started by getting a measurement for the bracket by using this blueprint from Gretsch. It's important with these brackets to always reference your measurement from the batter side so that when the tom is mounted, it's in roughly the same area for the player and not the audience perspective. I used a hole saw on the drill to cut a larger hole for the tom post, and then used the rubber gasket as a template while drilling out the 4 smaller holes to secure the bracket to the shell. After that, I could attach this bracket to the shell and head back downstairs to start drying out the first batch of hardware. I removed all the components out and set them on a towel to dry, and after I had all the lugs, screws, and various other pieces out to dry, I transferred the WD-40 to the next batch of hardware to begin working away on any rust on those pieces. While these pieces dried out, I used some tin foil to try and clean away any leftover rust or buildup on the metal, and then left all the pieces to dry out overnight while the rest of the hardware soaked.
The next day.
With this first batch of hardware completely dried, I moved it over to a container so I could transfer the currently soaking hardware onto the towel and repeat the same process. After I had all the parts removed from the WD-40, I then transferred it over to one more container with the bass drum spurs, as they were the final pieces that needed to soak. In retrospect, it would have been useful to not just throw all the dried out hardware into a bin and keep it a bit more organized to save time with assembly, but I was running out of work surfaces for all these parts, so it is what it is. With the second batch of hardware, I ended up bringing a box fan over to help with drying out overnight, but other than that, it was the exact same process of drying out hardware, using some tin foil and an old toothbrush to clean it up along the way. I did most of this by hand, but for the tension rods, I actually used a drum key drill bit to hold the tension rods and allow me to very quickly rotate them through some tinfoil, saving me a ton of time and elbow grease. With the second batch of hardware drying out and the third batch soaking, I could take the first batch out to my desk to begin reassembling the rack tom, floor tom, and snare. At this point, that only included the lugs, mounting brackets, and snare mechanism, but it was nice to see these drums starting to get reassembled and looking good. After another day of waiting for hardware to dry, I was able to begin reassembling the bass drum. It may not be worth noting, but instead of using a drill or driver, I'm using an electric screwdriver, which is basically a very low power drill that won't strip out any of these screws from the power or torque of an impact driver or drill. It's not a requirement, but it's a nice tool to have on hand to save me from doing all this work manually, and at the end of it, I counted well over 120 screws that needed to be reassembled in this process. After the last batch of hardware had enough time to soak, I was able to remove the 2 spurs and dry them out by hand, and then again go at them with the aluminum foil to remove any additional rust. And luckily on this same day, the first shipment of parts I ordered began to arrive. I struggled to find exact model numbers and replacement parts for these spurs, but I took a chance on these replacement parts by DW, knowing that they were at least similar to the spurs I had on this kit, and luckily, the lock nut and rubber feet both worked great, and I could now get these spurs back on the bass drum shell. After this, I could finally start getting the heads and hoops on these drums, beginning with the bass drum. I used some drum dial bearing edge conditioner on each side to give these edges a little bit of protection and lubrication. And when it came time to reattach the heads, I added some white lithium grease to each tension rod before threading it back into the lug. I don't think it's necessary every time you change heads to do this, but with these drums being in constant use for 15 years, it was definitely worthwhile to take these extra steps. After the bass drum was finished, I repeated the same process for both toms, but quickly used this time to go over the die-cast hoops with some tin foil to clean them up as well. There was a significant amount of pitting and flaking on these hoops, but there's not much I can do about that at this point without sending them somewhere to be re-chromed. I briefly looked into replacing these hoops, but decided against it because they still work and function fine despite some cosmetic deficiencies, and they're also really expensive to replace. After another day of waiting, the final shipment arrived with the new reso head, snare wires, and floor tom feet. So with that, I was able to put this snare together and replace the worn out feet on the floor tom legs, and have this kit pretty much finished. I took it over into my studio to set up, tune, and play, and then it was time to call this project a wrap and get these drums back to the high school. All in all, I spent $160 on parts, and typically on these projects I would have also had a fee for my time, but in this case, being my alma mater and an instrument that was very personal to my development, I decided to donate my time and the parts from my personal supply for this project. In the end, I wasn't able to get the tension rods looking totally new, and the hoops are still pitted, but all these drums function just fine, and they sound great. My hope is that my work on these drums will allow them to stay in service for the school for another 15 years. If you've ever taken on a project like this, I'd love to hear about it, so leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. Until next time, thanks.